I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Shauna Doll, who is an environmental specialist at Halifax Regional Municipality's Environment and Climate Change Division. She has a master's degree in environmental and resource management and a professional certification in ecological restoration. She is passionate about restoration as a pathway toward biodiversity recovery and building climate resilience. Shauna has worked closely on the Living Shoreline project in Lake Banook, which is the first naturalization project of its kind in HRM. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Shauna.
Hello, everybody. I think we could change over to the title slide, please. So as Kate said, my name is Shauna Doll. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an environmental specialist with HRM. And I would like to start off here by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from Mi'kma'ki, more specifically Winnamuwatich, which translates to at the Tom Cod place, known in English as Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. It is the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And the content of this presentation focuses on naturalization, a process often referred to by Indigenous knowledge holders I've been privileged to learn from as land healing. I acknowledge that I am an uninvited but grateful guest on these lands and hope to grow in this work in a way that is representative and in honor to the people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Next slide, please. So as a brief overview of this presentation, I'm going to start really broad and talk a lot about naturalization and living shorelines, and then focus in a little bit more on HRM's naturalization program and the Birch Cove case study more specifically, talk about some lessons learned, and then talk about some of the future projects that we hope to take on under the naturalization umbrella in HRM. Next slide, please. So as many of you joining here today probably already know, I saw that Mahone Bay joined. So we have like a very large body of listeners here. So this might be repetitive to some of you, but I hope that there's some nuggets of learning as well. Naturalization, sometimes called restoration, is an ecologically based approach to landscape management that seeks to enhance biodiversity and ecological resilience. And naturalized landscapes are inherently low maintenance and self-renewing, and often provide learning opportunities that foster environmental stewardship. Additional benefits of naturalization include urban area beautification, native biodiversity enhancement, wildlife habitat creation, slope stabilization, erosion control, stormwater runoff mitigation, and decreased municipal maintenance and operation costs over time, just to name a few. These sorts of services will become increasingly important in urban environments as the effects of climate change become more pronounced in years to come. Next slide, please. So what does naturalization look like? How do we find naturalization or restoration? The root of the word restoration is, of course, to restore, which literally means to go back or return to, but what states do we return to? How far do we go? For example, Mi'kma'ki was colonized hundreds of years ago, and prior to that, fire was not a significant disturbance type in Wabanaki Acadian forests necessarily. Wind throw was far more common, but otherwise some forests would grow and evolve relatively undisturbed for centuries. With settlers came the widespread introduction of fire and land clearing. And then newly introduced species also started to move in, and ultimately significant landscape change happened. And indeed, even prior to settler arrival, Mi'kma'ki people were on these lands for thousands of years and living in relationship to the land and influencing its shape and the ways that things were growing. So when we talk about restoration, it can be challenging to make decisions about what the land needs to truly heal. In these photos, for example, you see a comparison of a fully forested landscape near Musquodoboit Harbor that stands in pretty stark contrast to the patch of urban forest near the Dartmouth waterfront. So both of these places have over time been influenced by human activity, but both are still functioning ecosystems. They may be different in their level of functionality and the ways that they are functioning, but nonetheless, they are ecosystems and ecological places. Next slide, please. So because of these complexities, restoration practitioners often use reference ecosystems to inform restoration planning. This involves identifying one or more intact ecosystems that are geographically similar to the restoration sites that as a template to guide species planting and other restoration activities. So for example, a few weeks ago, HRM worked on a project to remove invasive yellow floating heart from Little Albro Lake in Dartmouth. This species was introduced probably by someone who dumped a fish tank into Little Albro Lake. And it's a very pretty plant, as you can see in that top right photo. It's beautiful, and that's often how invasive plants end up in new places. It's because people think that they're pretty or they remind them of something, and they kind of run away from us. But it does form really thick mats wherever it's introduced. So you see in the background photo there, that's Little Albro Lake, and it formed a very, very dense mat over the whole surface of the lake, which inhibited the growth of any native species. So you see in the bottom right corner, that's pickerel weed, which is a native plant species that we saw over in Big Albro Lake, which is not far away. And now that we have been working on the removal of yellow floating heart, we're using Big Albro Lake, which of course is also an impacted ecosystem, but still does have some native plant biodiversity, as a template for how we're going to replant this area over time as we get the yellow floating heart under control. So we're going to quickly flip through a couple of slides. So next slide, please. I just wanted to show how much yellow floating heart impacted this ecosystem. This is Little Albro Lake in 2015. And just focus on the left bottom corner here. And we'll take to the next slide in 2017, 2 years later. You see that it's expanding. Next slide in 2019, you see that it started to close in. And then in 2022, next slide, it really overtook the entire lake. So this is just an example of how we're going to use Big Albro Lake to help inform Little Albro Lake's restoration over time. Next slide, please. So naturalization as a nature-based solution. This is a complementary method to inform restoration planning. While when we start to think about the ecosystem services that could be provided by a functioning ecosystem that might be superior to what is currently on the ground. How could a parking lot, a lawn, or a golf course, for example, be improved to provide ecosystem services and enhance biodiversity? So in this photo, you see the beloved geese in around Sullivan's Pond in downtown Dartmouth. And essentially, this is a man-made lake. It's a lawn surrounding this man-made lake. And as much as these geese are really, really beloved by the community, there could be things done to this park that would make it a little bit more ecologically functional and potentially could provide more ecosystem services to the people who live there. So in this way, naturalization becomes a nature-based solution or a practice that aims to protect, sustainably manage, and or restore ecosystems to leverage their innate qualities, with the aim of mitigating the negative impacts of human activities on the environment and improving climate resilience. Next slide, please. So living shorelines are a prime example of nature-based solutions at work. Next slide. So this is a really great infographic that I borrowed from NOAA in the US. Living shorelines support resilient communities. So comparative to more conventional or harder human-driven interventions on coastlines like seawalls, living shorelines use naturalization techniques to address erosion and stabilize shorelines. They use native grasses, shrubs, and other related installations to act as a natural barrier against wave energy and storm surge. And though hard armoring options also can provide these services, they also can displace wave energy elsewhere. They're expensive to build and maintain, and their construction often results in negative environmental outcomes like habitat destruction. Living shorelines, on the other hand, provide a suite of co-benefits like improving water quality and providing wildlife habitat. And further, as they establish, that is, like as root systems start to develop, living shorelines can become more resilient and more effective over time, while their harder counterparts tend to do the opposite and start to break down over time and need more maintenance. Increasingly, shoreline hardening is done in combination with living shorelines to improve the outcomes of those hardening techniques. So you can see here from this infographic that marshes can trap sediments, living shorelines improve water quality, living shorelines are more resilient against storms and bulkheads. So there's a number of really great ecosystem services and co-benefits that come from living shorelines that hardened shorelines just don't provide. Next slide, please. So let's take this back to the HRM specifically, just to give a bit of a background. In 2017, Halifax Regional Council unanimously supported the development of a staff report exploring the possibility of implementing an HRM park naturalization strategy. And in 2022, after a 3-year pilot program, Council decided to make the naturalization program more permanent. Based on suggestions from residents, youth groups, council members, and municipal staff, over 32 sites, including park areas surrounding Lake Banook, have been identified as high priority for naturalization. There are exponentially more park and right-of-way sites that could benefit from naturalization efforts. These 32 sites are the primary focus of our naturalization program right now. Next slide, please. And this all relates back to Halifax. The naturalization program supports no less than 11 of the 46 actions identified by HRM's ambitious climate action plan, Halifax. That is, almost a quarter of Halifax actions relate to protecting, sustainably managing, enhancing, and/or harnessing the values of intact ecosystems. Most specifically, actions 21 and 22 are fulfilled by the naturalization program. And if folks haven't taken a look at Halifax before, I really recommend looking at it. It has some really great ideas for how to integrate environmentally minded programming into municipal activities. Next slide, please. So getting right into the Birch Cove Beach Shore Up project. Birch Cove Park is tucked away at the western edge of Lake Banook, opposite Highway 7 or Prince Albert Road in Dartmouth. If you have never been there or never heard of it, I wouldn't be altogether surprised. It's kind of hidden, and it's mostly used by people who live in Creighton Park in the Brightwood area of Dartmouth. And Lake Banook is the first natural lake along the Shubenacadie Canal waterway, and it has a really long history of a working waterway. Historically, it was used by the Mi'kmaq people as part of a marine highway, and its original name, Panook, means at the opening or the beginning, as part of that highway network. It was later used for ice production and harvest, which is something I did not know until very recently. And that enterprise lasted over 100 years, so people would harvest ice from here. And today, it's one of the most popular lakes in the province and is used very actively by canoe clubs and swimmers and other recreationists. If that's even a word, recreationists. But it's also bordered on two sides by major roadways, with Highway 111 specifically running right through the middle of Lake Banook and Lake Mi'kmaq. So I'm telling you all of this to let you know like how historically this lake has been very impacted by human activities. So all of these things together were some of the reasons why Birch Cove was chosen as one of our first major restoration sites under the naturalization program back in June of this year. This was a program that was undertaken, obviously, with Helping Nature Heal, as you can see on this slide, and Ecology Action Center offered a great deal of support as well. It was one of the first naturalization projects of this scale to happen under the naturalization program. As I said, there was a similar Shoreline project that was undertaken at St. Mary's Boat Club some years ago, but this was more of a kind of breaking through of the naturalization program to really represent the things to come under this program in the future. Next slide, please. So as you can see from these pictures, Birch Cove Beach doesn't really have a lot going on by way of biodiversity. There's a slight retaining wall there. It's inundated with droppings from a hyper-abundant goose population, and truly this was one of the biggest issues at this place. It was providing very little by way of ecosystem services. It's susceptible to erosion given that it's at the bottom of a hill. This retaining wall does provide some support, but over time, it's likely that the shoreline and the slope will continue to slump. There's some sand that's here that was brought in from elsewhere. Altogether, it just wasn't really much to look at, other than it was a place for people to get into the water and swim, but more and more people weren't doing that because of geese and also sometimes dogs off leash pooping along the shoreline and really introducing more nutrients into the system. Next slide, please. So to address all of these issues, this is a nice picture because it gives you the image of the beach from the other side. So you can see at the far end here, there's still a swimming beach that is being left intact. So the recreational values of the place can still be enjoyed by the neighboring communities. But this place where the slope starts to get a little bit more steep was where we focused our energies, and we installed some wattle fencing all around the restoration site. Wattle fencing, for those who don't know, it's formed largely of, or sometimes not so much, but live cuttings are usually what makes up these fences. In this case, we used cuttings from alders and wove live cuttings into it. But it's a way of creating basically a living fence so that over time, as the natural building materials degrade, the living stakes continue to provide the structural integrity of the fencing. It also performs another function where it traps some sediment, so it can help to build up the soil over time as the fence degrades and as the plants become more established. Yeah, so just to reiterate, these are alder cuttings that are quite pliable, and these stakes that we use, the live stakes, were made of willow. So those two materials are really great to use for situations like this because they are so pliable, and they also tend to be pretty resilient and able to take root in a number of different conditions, particularly along waterways. Next slide, please. So this shows a photo of the complete fence along one edge of the restoration site. And you can also see that we put some barriers on the internal area of the planting site. These barriers are to prevent geese from landing. As I mentioned before, goose droppings were a really big issue with this site. So these barriers are a really well-known technique in goose management. Not only do geese like to have a nice open area to land in when they have their young, they're obviously not flying a whole heck of a lot. They're more walking around, and these barriers will prevent them from walking around in the site. So overall, these barriers break up the large open area and dissuade geese from landing here. Next slide, please. The next step was to dig the planting hole. So this was on day 2 of our 3-day restoration project. Helping Nature Heal tries to avoid using as gas-powered engines as much as possible. So all of this was done by hand. Those stakes for the wattle fencing were all tapped in by volunteers and Helping Nature Heal staff, and all of the holes were also dug by our intrepid team of volunteers. Oh, I just noticed that it's myself in that picture tying up the stake. I didn't realize that when I chose this picture. And we also had volunteers who were trucking buckets of soil from big piles that were on the pathway just above where this picture was taken. Next slide, please. And here is a photo of the collection of plants that we used in all of those holes that we dug. One aim of this naturalization project, in addition to dissuading geese from spending time there, was to reintroduce some native biodiversity to this site. So a majority of the plants used were native to the Wabanaki Acadian forest region. And these included shrubby trees like speckled alder and pussy willow, shrubs like early low bush blueberry and black huckleberry, herbs and forbs like wild strawberry and swamp milkweed, and some native grasses as well, like American beach grass. However, one of the big challenges with restoration projects like this, specifically in Nova Scotia, but I imagine that a lot of places experience this challenge, is the native seed supply is really limited. Not a lot of nurseries are supplying the volume of plants that these kinds of projects demand. So from time to time, we have to also use naturalized species or non-native species that are not invasive, but not necessarily of this place. So that's something to keep in mind when planning restoration projects like this. Next slide, please. So here's a photo of the planting as it advanced through the second day of our installation. So as you can see, we have this lineup of willow along the wattle fencing on the water's edge, and this is another reason that willow is a really great plant to use in projects like this, because willow do really like to have their feet wet, so they can be planted in the sandy soil along the waterway and be woven into that fence, excuse me, to create stabilization on that shoreline over time. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say here. Next slide, please. So the last step on the 3rd day of our 3-day project was monitoring. We were taught a number of methods by helping nature heal, including shoreline stakes to measure the amount of erosion happening at the project site, as well as vegetation density monitoring. We also had a very dedicated volunteer who recorded every single planting in an iNaturalist project, so we could track how many plants we had planted of each different species, and to also keep track of what other kinds of species start to flourish in this site as seed gets carried over, as we start to see birds and other critters spend time here and dropping other types of seed. And over time, we're hoping that this site will need decreasing amounts of maintenance as it becomes established. And this is another really big consideration when taking on projects like this, is not all municipalities or organizations will have the capacity to continue to do monitoring over time. So it's really important to consider when you're collecting data for projects like this, how will this data be used, and will the capacity that you dedicate to this project be effectively used over time? So we did get taught the method of how to measure shoreline erosion here, but because of the substrate that was there, we couldn't really get the pilings in as far as we would have liked to measure that erosive force. And because this is a pretty low wave energy spot, we decided that we wouldn't keep those stakes in, particularly because people do continue to walk along this shoreline, and there was a tripping hazard with having a big metal rod sticking out of the beach. So these are all considerations where you kind of have to adapt and be flexible with the monitoring techniques that you put into place depending on where the project is implemented. Next slide, please. This is just a picture of the group of people that stuck with us all through the 3 days. Some of the people actually we picked up over time, who just showed up on the 3rd day because they saw us working, and it was really just an incredible group. We had about 30 people every day coming out and doing this work for us. We installed some of these signs to let people know what was happening and to try to call people into the continued maintenance of this site. This is a really high use project site, so I think it's really important to keep people informed about what's happening and to help people feel a sense of accountability and ownership over these projects, so that they can learn from them and help to steward them over time, and we can create a bit of a culture of conservation around sites like this. So next slide, please. This is just a photo I took. I was out on a paddleboard and I tried to take a picture of the whole site. I think this is the closest I got to an entire site. This was just a couple of days after it was planted, and it gives a bit of a further view of what it looked like immediately after planting. It doesn't look like much just yet, but on the next slide, I took a nice close-up of the vegetation. So all of these wildflowers started to bloom here in the fall, and most of the site just looked like this just a couple of weeks ago now, I guess it was. And the fence has held up beautifully. I think that there was the first day that it was installed, one of my friends called me and said that it had been vandalized. And I went, and I lived right next door to it at the time, and went and looked at it, and it was not vandalized. And I was so relieved. And the community has been really respectful of this installation. One sign has gone missing of the 3, and otherwise it has held up beautifully over the last few months. Next slide, please. All right, so just like some really high level lessons learned. One of the big ones was engaging with the community is key. We did our best to outreach to people, but it was right at the beginning of summer, right around the solstice. And so as much as we tried to connect with people, a lot of folks were coming and walking through the site and had no idea what was happening, even though they lived just next door. So keeping those lines of communication open is just really important, and knowing that maybe you won't reach everybody, but being prepared to chat with people the day of something like this happening is really important. Almost everyone that walked by was incredibly supportive of this. I was truly stunned at how some people had emotional reactions to being so pleased that something like this was happening. We had a couple people walk by that were a bit disappointed that their sitting sites that they always went to after dinner to watch the sun go down over the water were no longer accessible. But being able to point out other places where those activities were still viable in the park, I think was a great way to kind of meet people in the middle, even if they were disappointed that their kind of learned behavior was being interrupted by this new installation. Another big lesson is flexibility and adaptability are necessary. As I mentioned, sometimes we have to use different kinds of plants. Sometimes you get more volunteers than you think or less volunteers than you think, and you just have to be ready to kind of shift things up and go with the flow. And the biggest lesson of all is we can't do it alone. More and more as I dive into this work, there's just so many sites that need to be restored. There's so much work that needs to be done. And this work is such a true pleasure to connect with the land and to connect with one another. And I think that people almost, I would say, all of us on this call here today have a place that we love to spend time and would just be tickled to be able to help that place heal by planting native plants or removing invasives or doing something of that nature. I think calling in that community of people to do this work and advance it is going to be really important, especially as the impacts of climate change become increasingly apparent. Next slide, please. So looking to the future, we hope to undertake more of these projects, calling in people from the community, as I mentioned, to help us grow program efficacy. We are currently working on developing a prioritization tool so that we can be sure to prioritize the right sites at the right time based on multiple factors. These range from social factors like equitability and accessibility to biodiversity factors like habitat provision, need for invasive species management, need for ecosystem services such as stormwater, flood attenuation, things like that. So we're working with a team of students right now to build basically the foundational framework for that prioritization tool. And along with that, we're having discussions about how do we start to think about other sites. Like 32 sites is a lot of sites for us to focus on right now, but there are so many other places in HRM that could use this kind of healing. So how do we start to think about those new sites? Who do we take those suggestions from? How do we know what sites need to be addressed first? So those are all things that we're really focusing on right now to develop the naturalization program further and make sure it's informed by the community, but also by the science. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I just provided a list of resources here for people if you want to do further reading on some of the programming that's being offered in Nova Scotia and further afield. There's also just some acknowledgements for all of the folks who took the beautiful pictures as part of this presentation. And last slide. So time for questions and discussion. I welcome anyone to reach out to me with any questions they might have, or my colleague Tracy Jessen, who's the naturalization coordinator with HRM, who I know would also be really keen to answer any questions people have about this work that Halifax is doing.